During World War II, violence ceased to be a means to win battles and became an end in itself. On different fronts, thousands of people were persecuted, eliminated, or used as instruments without trials or any distinction. There was no improvisation or surprise. The actions were repeated in different countries under different forms, but with the same pattern: capture, subdue, destroy. The environment facilitated crime becoming custom, that no one prevented it, and that it was executed with a speed that gave no margin for reaction. What exactly were those atrocities? What allowed them to be repeated for years before everyone's eyes? And how far were they willing to go? The Holocaust, the machinery of racial genocide. Between 1941 and 1945, the Third Reich executed the systematic murder of 6 million European Jews. This operation did not arise from spontaneous violence or wartime chaos. It was the result of institutional coordination that transformed bureaucrats, engineers, doctors, and ordinary soldiers into gears of a death machine that redefined the limits of organized cruelty. The architecture of genocide began long before the gas chambers. In 1933, with Adolf Hitler's rise to power, the first laws excluded Jews from German public life. Labor, educational, and social restrictions laid the legal foundations for what would come later. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their German citizenship and criminalized relationships between Jews and Aryans, establishing a legal framework for racial persecution. With the invasion of Poland in September 1939, anti-Semitic policy entered a radically new phase. German authorities created ghettos in Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and dozens of other cities. These walled spaces concentrated hundreds of thousands of people in conditions designed to accelerate death. The Warsaw Ghetto housed more than 400,000 people in just 3.4 square kilometers. Without adequate heating, with insufficient food rations, and without medical care, thousands died each month from hunger, disease, and arbitrary executions. On January 20, 1942, 15 high officials of the Nazi regime met in an elegant villa in Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin. The conference, convened by Reinhard Heydrich under direct instructions from Heinrich Himmler, officialized what had already begun in secret: the final solution of the Jewish question. The minutes of the meeting, written in bureaucratic and euphemistic language, established that 11 million European Jews should be deported to extermination camps in eastern Poland, where they would be eliminated en masse. The logistical coordination of this operation reached extraordinary dimensions. Jews were deported from all occupied territories: France, Holland, Belgium, Greece, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. They were crammed into cattle cars without water, food, or adequate ventilation for days. Extreme temperatures, lack of oxygen, and desperation caused deaths before reaching the destination. The Deutsche Reichsbahn coordinated these transports as if they were ordinary merchandise. The preserved records contain invoices where the SS paid tariffs per head and per kilometer traveled. Between 1942 and 1944, 5 extermination camps operated in Poland with the sole purpose of killing: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Majdanek. Each was designed to maximize the efficiency of mass murder. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the most infamous symbol of this machinery. The complex included more than 40 subcamps, but Birkenau housed the extermination facilities. 4 crematoria with integrated gas chambers could murder up to 6,000 people in a single day. Victims were separated upon arrival. Those considered fit for work were sent to barracks. The rest, children, elderly, mothers with small children, were directed immediately to the chambers. The facilities were designed to deceive and control. The gas chambers simulated collective showers, complete with false showerheads and signs that instructed victims to remember where they had left their belongings. Once people were locked in, Zyklon B was introduced, a cyanide-based pesticide that caused death by asphyxiation in a few minutes. The corpses were removed by Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners coerced into handling the bodies, extracting gold teeth and loading the corpses into the crematory ovens. The smoke from the chimneys was constant, visible from kilometers away. Treblinka operated between July 1942 and October 1943, responsible for more than 800,000 deaths. Unlike Auschwitz, it was not a labor camp, it was a pure death factory. Those who arrived were murdered immediately after their arrival. The camp used gas chambers fed by gasoline engines whose gases were directed toward airtight compartments. The process lasted between 20 and 30 minutes. Initially, the bodies were buried in mass graves, but Operation Action 1005 ordered their exhumation and burning to erase evidence of the crime. Sobibor and Belzec functioned with almost identical systems. Trains arrived, passengers were deceived and forced to undress, then directed toward tunnels camouflaged with vegetation that led to the gas chambers. In Belzec, between 434,000 and 600,000 people died. In Sobibor, between 170,000 and 250,000. The efficiency was such that these camps could process complete transports in a few hours. The extermination orders were not ambiguous or accidental. Internal correspondence between Himmler and his subordinates clearly specified the total elimination of European Judaism. Adolf Eichmann, the principal logistical architect of the deportations, personally supervised the transport of millions toward death. Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, perfected the gassing methods and explained in detail to his subordinates how to maintain the fiction that these were showers. In camps that were not purely extermination camps, prisoners were forced to work as slave labor. German companies like IG Farben, Krupp and Siemens employed tens of thousands of Jews in forced labor. They worked in extreme conditions, with shifts of more than 12 hours, without sufficient food, exposed to toxic chemicals, extreme cold and constant violence. The concept of Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through work, consisted of exploiting prisoners until physical collapse, at which point they were sent to the gas chambers. The Holocaust was not committed by isolated psychopaths, but by an entire society turned into an accomplice of genocide. Each step, from anti-Semitic laws to crematoria, was executed with administrative precision and technological efficiency. The preserved documents reveal a chain of responsibility that extended from Hitler and Himmler to train conductors, camp guards, and technicians who operated the gas chambers. The ghettos, death trains, gas chambers, and slave labor were interconnected components of a governmental strategy designed for total annihilation. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, Belzec, and Sobibor were not historical aberrations, but the logical expression of an ideology that had redefined millions of human beings as obstacles to be eliminated through industrial death. Operation Barbarossa, extermination on the Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in history. Operation Barbarossa was not simply an invasion, it was the beginning of a racial and ideological war where Nazism attempted not only to defeat a military enemy, but to annihilate entire peoples and redesign the demographic map of Eastern Europe. Hitler had made it clear to his generals that this war would be different from any previous conflict. It would not be a war between professional armies governed by international conventions, but a struggle between irreconcilable ideologies where traditional rules of war would be suspended. In this context, a series of orders were issued prior to the invasion that legalized the brutality that would follow. The Commissar Decree instructed that captured Soviet political commissars should be executed summarily without trial or interrogation. The guidelines for the conduct of troops in Russia established that German soldiers would not be judged for crimes committed against Soviet civilians. Finally, the order to liquidate all Jews in positions of political or social leadership represented an anticipated death sentence for millions of people. The Einsatzgruppen were the special units charged with implementing this extermination campaign. These mobile death units, subordinated to the Reich Main Security Office, closely followed the regular German army in its advance toward the east. Composed of SS men, Gestapo, and criminal police, they also included Wehrmacht, soldiers, and thousands of local anti-Semitic collaborators. They were organized into 4 large groups that covered the entire front. Einsatzgruppe A advanced through the Baltic countries, B operated in Belarus, C in central Ukraine, and D in southern Ukraine and Crimea. Each group had between 500 and 1,000 German personnel, supported by thousands of Latvian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and other auxiliaries who actively participated in the killings. The operations followed a predictable and lethal pattern: arrival at a city or town, identification of the Jewish population through local records or denunciations, mass arrests, confiscation of properties, and mass shootings in forests or on the outskirts of populations. In some cases, victims were compelled to dig their own graves. In others, natural ravines or abandoned mines were used to hide the bodies. Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, became the symbol of this horror. On September 29 and 30, 1941, Einsatzgruppe C, commanded by Friedrich Jeckeln and Paul Blobel, murdered more than 33,000 Jews in just 2 days. Victims were forced to undress, surrender their belongings and march toward the ravine, where they were executed in batches with shots to the back of the neck. The official report of the Einsatzgruppe recorded with administrative detachment, 33,771 Jews were eliminated in Kiev from September 29 to 30. The murders at Babi Yar continued for years. It is estimated that up to 100,000 people, including Roma, mentally ill and Soviet prisoners, were murdered at that location. In 1943, faced with the Soviet advance, the Nazis forced Jewish prisoners to exhume and burn the corpses to hide the crime. These prisoners were also executed once their task was completed. In Rumbula, near Riga, more than 25,000 Jews from the local ghetto were murdered on November 30th and December 8, 1941, by Einsatzgruppe A and Latvian police forces. People were coerced into walking to the forest where mass graves had already been excavated. Victims were shot in groups of 10, falling onto corpses already piled up. The operation was planned with military precision. Roads were built to facilitate transport, controls were installed to prevent escapes, and everything was timed to maximize the efficiency of murder. In Ponary, on the outskirts of Vilna, Einsatzkommando 9 murdered close to 70,000 people between 1941 and 1944. The victims were mainly Jews, but also Poles, communists, and dissidents. The executions were carried out in a former Soviet fuel depot adapted as an execution pit. The killings were almost daily, with executioners working in shifts. Accounts describe how blood flowed through drainage channels and how Ponary became a sinister open-air execution ground. Operation Barbarossa also marked the beginning of the implementation of General Plan Ost, the Nazi plan to colonize Eastern Europe. This project, coordinated by Himmler, contemplated the murder of tens of millions of Slavs by hunger, forced deportation, or direct execution. The objective was the Germanization of Ukraine and other fertile agricultural zones, which required the elimination of their original inhabitants. An example of this strategy was Belarus, where more than 5,000 villages were burned, many with their inhabitants locked inside. In Ukraine, planned famine killed hundreds of thousands of children. The genocide was not limited to Jews. It was a racial war against all Eastern peoples considered inferior by Nazi ideology. In the Nuremberg trials and subsequent processes, many members of the Einsatzgruppen were tried and executed. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, declared that his unit had murdered more than 90,000 people, a figure he provided without showing remorse. Paul Blobel, responsible for Babi Yar, acknowledged his direct participation in mass shootings and in the subsequent destruction of evidence. Testimonies of survivors, such as the accounts of Soviet journalist Vasily Grossman, documented with chilling precision the magnitude of the massacres. Grossman described mothers buried alive with their children, the indifference of German soldiers to suffering, and how they distributed watches and rings of victims as if they were war trophies. Operation Barbarossa established a model of racial war that transcended all moral or legal limitations. It was not just a military offensive, but the pillar of an extermination strategy that sought to redesign Eastern Europe according to the principles of Aryan supremacy. In the forests of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, the Third Reich inaugurated a form of war without limits where death by mass bullets anticipated and complemented the gas chambers. This theater of operations demonstrated that genocide did not require specialized installations. It was enough to have the political will to kill and the administrative organization to do it efficiently. The atrocities of the Japanese Empire, from Nanking to the Pacific. On December 13, 1937, when Japanese troops entered Nanking, the former Chinese capital, they did not limit themselves to occupying a strategic city. During the following 6 weeks, they perpetrated one of the most systematic and brutal massacres of modern warfare, establishing a pattern of cruelty that would extend throughout the Pacific during the following years. The entry of Japanese forces into Nanking was not an uncontrolled military operation. It was a deliberate action authorized by high-ranking officers, including Prince Asaka, uncle of Emperor Hirohito, who issued direct orders that allowed the mass execution of Chinese prisoners and turned the city into a free zone for indiscriminate troop violence. During those weeks, between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were murdered in the cruelest ways imaginable. Thousands of prisoners were shot in groups over trenches dug especially to become mass graves. Photographic files, many taken by Japanese soldiers themselves as souvenirs, document endless rows of corpses piled on the banks of the Yangtze River. Some Japanese officers organized decapitation competitions, competing over who could cut more heads with their katana in less time. These competitions were even reported in Japanese newspapers as heroic feats. Children were used as practice for bayonet training. Babies were thrown into the air and speared with bayonets before touching the ground. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women of all ages were raped during those weeks. Many were murdered after sexual assault, others were mutilated, impaled, or forced to witness the rape of family members before being executed. The chronicles of German John Rabe, a Nazi party member who tried to protect civilians by creating an international safety zone, describe Nanking as a hell on earth where human cruelty reached unimaginable limits. The Nanking Massacre established the behavioral model that Japanese forces would replicate in all territories they occupied during the war. This pattern included the institutionalization of sexual slavery on an unprecedented scale in modern military history. Between 100,000 and 200,000 women were forced to become comfort women, a euphemism to designate the sexual slaves of the Japanese Imperial Army. The victims came mainly from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, and occupied territories in Southeast Asia. They were recruited through elaborate deceptions, direct kidnappings, or simply captured by military units. The so-called comfort stations were military brothels installed next to battlefronts where women were repeatedly raped, frequently by 30 or 40 soldiers per day. Survivor accounts describe conditions that defy human understanding: degrading medical inspections performed as if they were livestock, forced sterilizations to prevent pregnancies, abortions performed without anesthesia, and the murder of those who became ill or useless for military purposes. In many cases, women were used as objects of collective punishment when Japanese units suffered casualties in combat. Others were deliberately infected with venereal diseases to study medical treatments. When women died from disease, exhaustion, or suicide, they were simply replaced by new victims. During the battle for the recovery of Manila in 1945, Japanese troops on the verge of defeat initiated a desperate massacre that cost the lives of more than 100,000 Filipino civilians. The city became a slaughterhouse where entire families were burned alive in churches and hospitals. Women were raped and beheaded with bayonets. Children were thrown from balconies or split in half before their parents. San Juan de Dios Hospital became a symbol of this barbarity when doctors, nurses, and patients were executed without mercy. Japanese soldiers seemed to compete in inventing new forms of cruelty, as if the proximity of defeat had released all the most sadistic instincts. In Singapore, after the fall of the city in February 1942, the Japanese army carried out Operation Suk Ching, a mass purge against the local Chinese population. In a few days, between 25,000 and 50,000 people were executed under the accusation of collaborating with the British. Bodies were transported in trucks to beaches and ravines where they were shot in groups. Many died from forced burial when the pits filled with still living victims. The treatment of Allied prisoners of war deliberately violated all existing international conventions. More than 140,000 British, Australian, American, and other nationality soldiers were captured between 1941 and 1945. Conditions in Japanese camps were designed to cause slow death through exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. The notorious Burma Railway, known as the Death Railway, was built using forced labor from Allied prisoners and Asian civilian workers. More than 12,000 Western prisoners and between 80,000 and 100,000 Asian workers died during its construction. Prisoners worked 18 hours daily in extreme tropical conditions, with survival rations that provided less than 500 calories daily. Torture and executions for minor offenses or without any justification were routine. Punishments were applied publicly to terrorize the rest of the prisoners. Escape attempts were punished not only by executing captured fugitives, but also by murdering other prisoners selected randomly as collective warning. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, established in 1946, prosecuted the main Japanese leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. For more than 2 years of hearings, thousands of documents and testimonies were presented that revealed the deliberate magnitude of these crimes. Sworn statements from enslaved women, tortured Allied soldiers and diplomats who witnessed massacres provided irrefutable evidence. Military orders showed a direct chain of command from the Japanese High General Staff to the officers who executed the atrocities. Footage and photographs taken by Japanese soldiers themselves documented the brutality with a coldness that was almost as disturbing as the acts themselves. 28 key figures of the Japanese military regime were prosecuted. 7 were sentenced to death, including General Hideki Tojo. However, members of the imperial family, such as Emperor Hirohito and Prince Asaka, were exempted from all responsibility by political decision of the Allies, who considered their prosecution counterproductive to regional stability. The atrocities of the Japanese Empire during World War II were not accidents of war or excesses of undisciplined soldiers. They constituted an integral occupation strategy that combined extreme racism, absolute contempt for human life, and the use of terror as a tool of political and military control. From the impalements in Nanking to the beatings in prisoner camps, passing through the rapes in Manila and the military brothels, the pattern was consistent and documented. This institutionalized brutality revealed how a military culture can become corrupted to the point of justifying any atrocity in the name of strategic or ideological objectives. Human experiments, science converted into torture. During World War II, medical and scientific knowledge was perverted and transformed into an instrument of torture and extermination. In the laboratories of Nazi concentration camps and in the secret installations of the Japanese army, doctors with university training, respected bacteriologists, and specialized technicians abandoned all professional ethics to convert human beings into experimental material. The concentration camps of Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz were transformed into laboratories where medicine was put at the service of the Nazi war machine. In Dachau, under direct orders from the Luftwaffe, experiments were conducted to study the effects of extreme altitude and hypothermia on the human organism. Freezing experiments subjected prisoners to prolonged immersions in tanks of ice water to simulate the conditions faced by German pilots shot down in the North Sea. Some prisoners remained submerged until their body temperature descended to lethal levels. Others were revived through methods that included boiling water showers, exposure to intense heat lamps, or forced contact with female prisoners as part of the resuscitation treatment. In low-pressure chambers, altitudes of up to 20,000 meters were simulated to study the effects of decompression on the brain and internal organs. Reports by Dr. Sigmund Rascher graphically describe how the eyes of experimental subjects exploded from pressure and how the brain decomposed while victims remained conscious during the first minutes of the process. In Ravensbrück, the exclusive camp for women, doctors practiced experimental surgical interventions without anesthesia. Victims were deliberately infected with bacteria such as Streptococcus and Clostridium perfringens. Wounds were opened in prisoners' legs and fragments of wood, glass, and dirt were introduced to simulate battle wounds. Then blood circulation was cut to create conditions similar to gangrene at the front. Female prisoners were also subjected to experimental amputations, followed by transplant attempts that invariably failed, leaving victims crippled for life. Sterilization experiments exposed thousands of women to direct radiation in the ovaries and uterus. Others were injected with corrosive substances that caused sterility but also chronic pain and fatal cancers. In Auschwitz, Josef Mengele developed his obsession with twins. Jewish, Roma, and Polish twin children were selected upon arrival at the camp and taken to special barracks, where Mengele performed anatomical comparisons, blood cross-transfusions, injections with various viruses, and parallel vivisections. If one of the twins died during an experiment, the other was immediately murdered to allow comparative autopsies. Mengele also experimented with eye heterochromia, injecting chemical substances into children's eyes to try to change their color. Most of these experiments resulted in permanent blindness or infections that caused death. Gynecological experiments performed on women and girls under the excuse of studying racial fertility included surgical sterilizations without anesthesia and the extraction of reproductive organs for histological analysis. In the Pacific, Squadron 731 of the Japanese Army established in Harbin, Manchuria, the most sinister medical experimentation center of the war. Under the direction of General Shiro Ishii, this installation was officially presented as an institute for disease prevention, but functioned as a scientific extermination laboratory. More than 10,000 prisoners, mainly Chinese, Russians, Koreans, and Mongols, were used as experimental subjects. Prisoners were called maruta, wooden logs, in a deliberate attempt at dehumanization that facilitated their use as laboratory material. Squadron 731's experiments included the deliberate infection of prisoners with deadly pathogens such as bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax, and tuberculosis. Experimental subjects were then vivisected without anesthesia while diseases progressed to study the development of infections in living internal organs. Practices included the extraction of lungs, stomachs, and intestines in conscious subjects. Double amputations were performed, followed by incorrect reimplantation to study gangrene and tissue regeneration processes. Controlled freezing experiments submerged extremities in ice water, beat them until the ice sounded like wood, and then heated them with fire or hot air while each phase of decomposition was recorded. The installation also developed biological weapons that were used against Chinese civilian populations. Plague-infected rats were released in rural villages. Bombs loaded with typhus-carrying fleas were dropped on cities. Drinking water and food reserves were deliberately contaminated. Between 1939 and 1945, it is estimated that more than 300,000 Chinese civilians died from artificial epidemics caused by these biological warfare experiments. In 1946, the Nuremberg Tribunal held the doctors' trial, prosecuting 23 Nazi doctors. 16 were convicted and 7 executed. The prosecution presented chilling evidence, photographs of operations, medical instruments used in torture, detailed records with coded names, and testimonies from surviving victims. This trial established the Nuremberg Code, which defined the fundamental ethical principles of modern medical research: informed consent, absence of coercion, risk and benefit evaluation, and the right of subjects to withdraw their participation at any time. These principles became the basis for all subsequent medical ethics. Unlike the trial in Germany, the Tokyo Tribunal did not prosecute Shiro Ishii or his Squadron 731 colleagues. The United States offered them immunity in exchange for sharing their biological weapons research, a decision that generated an ethical controversy that persists today. The information obtained from these experiments was considered too militarily valuable to be discarded for moral considerations. Some former Squadron 731 members confessed decades later in recorded interviews. They acknowledged having dissected pregnant women alive, having caused deliberate epidemics, and having studied the decomposition of human bodies while victims remained conscious. These late confessions confirmed what captured documents had already revealed about the magnitude of these crimes. Medical experiments during World War II represent one of the greatest ethical failures of modern science. Beyond any knowledge they might have generated, what remains in historical memory is the deliberate destruction of human lives, absolute contempt for others' pain, and the total dehumanization of medical practice. These cases demonstrate how science, when divorced from ethics and subordinated to military or ideological objectives, can become the most refined instrument of human cruelty. Nazi reprisals, the policy of terror in occupied Europe. In Europe occupied by the Third Reich, Nazi violence transcended battlefields and concentration camps to become a deliberate strategy of reprisals against innocent civilian populations. Faced with each act of resistance, the German response did not seek to be proportional. It was designed to be exemplary, excessive, and terrorizing. Hitler, Himmler, and their generals adopted the principle of 10 for 1 as official doctrine. For each German soldier killed in a partisan attack, 10 civilians would be executed. This formula was not a symbolic threat. It was applied literally in hundreds of cases and was frequently exceeded. Reprisals were not wartime accidents or excesses of undisciplined soldiers. They were calculated instruments of political control designed to break the morale of occupied peoples and eliminate any possibility of resistance. On June 10, 1942, the small village of Lidice in the Bohemia region ceased to exist. It was not destroyed by enemy bombing, but by the organized revenge of the SS as reprisal for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, architect of the final solution, mortally wounded by Czech fighters trained by the British. Lidice had no connection whatsoever with the perpetrators of the attack. It was selected at random as a reprisal target, a demonstration that Nazi revenge did not distinguish between guilty and innocent. At dawn, the village was surrounded by German troops. All men over 15 years old were taken from their houses, lined up against walls and shot in groups of 10. 173 men died. The 184 women were deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where most died in the following months. The 88 children were separated from their mothers. Some were sent to extermination camps, others selected for forced Germanization programs based on racial criteria. Only 17 children survived the war. After the executions, the town was systematically annihilated. Houses were burned, dynamited, and then razed by bulldozers. Trees were cut down, cemetery graves were destroyed, and even the name Lidice was eliminated from all official records. The message was unequivocal. Where life and community had existed, only emptiness should remain as a warning to others. 2 years later, the horror was repeated in France. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after the Allied landing in Normandy, the SS division Das Reich massacred 642 people in the quiet town of Oradour-sur-Glane. Without prior warning or clear justification, soldiers gathered the entire population in the town square. Men were taken to barns and stables where they were machine-gunned. Women and children, 452 in total, were locked in the town church. Soldiers filled the building with combustible materials and set it on fire. Those who tried to escape through windows were machine-gunned. Only one woman, Marguerite Roufanche, survived by jumping through a rear window, and 5 men managed to escape by pretending to be dead among the corpses. The massacre was a reprisal for supposed partisan activity in the region and for the disappearance of a German officer. But Oradour was not a resistance center. There were no hidden weapons or fighters. There were only ordinary inhabitants, artisans, farmers, children at school, who were executed for the simple fact of living in the wrong place at the wrong time. After the war, French President Charles de Gaulle ordered that the town not be rebuilt, so that its ruins would serve as a perpetual memorial to Nazi barbarity. A new Oradour was built near the original, but the ruins remain intact. Charred cars, the church bell melted by heat, houses without roofs, an entire town stopped at the exact moment of horror. Between September and October 1944, the Nazi army executed the largest civilian massacre in Italy. In the Marzabotto region in Emilia-Romagna, the SS, led by Walter Redder, organized a systematic human hunt as reprisal for partisan activity in the area. Troops surrounded the hill villages and began executing everyone they found, without distinctions of age or sex. Complete families were shot in their homes. Others were grouped in churches or stables and murdered with machine gun bursts. Babies were smashed against walls. Women were raped before being executed. In total, between 770 and 1,830 people died. The objective was not only reprisal, it was preventive annihilation, a cleansing of territory that would eliminate any possible support for resistance. Walter Redder was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1951, but released in 1985 due to diplomatic pressure, generating deep indignation in Italy and questioning post-war justice. In Belarus, the small town of Katyn became a symbol of Slavic genocide. On March 22, 1943, SS troops accompanied by local collaborators surrounded the town as reprisal for the death of a German officer in a nearby partisan ambush. The 149 inhabitants of Katyn were locked in a wooden barn that was set on fire with them inside. Those who tried to escape the fire were machine-gunned at the door. Among the victims were 75 children, including babies. Only 6 people survived, including a 12-year-old boy who managed to crawl out of the barn while his clothes burned. Katyn was not the only village destroyed in this way in Belarus. In that territory alone, the Nazis destroyed more than 5,000 towns, many with their entire population locked inside burning buildings. This was part of a deliberate depopulation strategy that sought to empty entire territories for future German colonization. The 10-for-1 principle had been formalized in a directive signed by General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel on September 16, 1941, which officially established this reprisal ratio. The document specified that if an attack occurs against a German force, 50 to 100 communists will be executed as reprisal without need for trial or evidence of individual guilt. On many occasions, executions far exceeded this ratio. In Kraljevo, Serbia, more than 2,000 civilians were murdered in reprisal for the death of 10 German soldiers. In Rome, 335 Italians were executed at the Fosse Ardeatine after an ambush that had caused the death of 33 German soldiers. The logic was simple: collective terror was more effective than individual justice. After each massacre came organized silence. Bodies were burned or buried in mass graves. Houses were burned to the foundations. Victims' names were erased from civil records. It was a strategy of disappearance and annulment that sought to eliminate not only people, but also their memory and their place in history. However, survivors preserved that memory. Testimonies such as those of Marguerite Roufanche in Oradour, who escaped from the hell of the church, or of the few people who survived Katyn, became bridges between the past and justice. Their accounts, preserved in subsequent trials and historical archives, ensured that these crimes would not be forgotten. Nazi reprisals against innocent civilians were not wartime excesses or acts of soldiers out of control. They were governmental strategies designed to sow terror, break resistance, and demonstrate that the price of opposing the Reich would be paid not only by fighters, but by entire communities. They represented a particular form of state terrorism that used calculated brutality as a tool of political domination. Mass bombings, the war that erased cities from the map. At the end of World War II, traditional rules of combat were replaced by a new military doctrine: total destruction. Cities ceased to be considered simply as logistical or industrial centers to become legitimate targets for their capacity to break enemy morale. The civilian population ceased to be collateral damage to be transformed into a direct strategic objective. The mass bombings on Dresden, Hamburg, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki marked the culminating point of this strategy. These attacks raised fundamental questions that persist today. Were they legitimate military actions designed to accelerate the end of the war and save lives? Or did they constitute war crimes perpetrated by the Allies with the same brutality they condemned in their enemies? On the night of February 13, 1945, Dresden, known as the Florence of the Elbe for its Baroque churches, museums, and opera theatres, was razed by the most controversial bombing of the war in Europe. The operation combined two nocturnal waves of the British Royal Air Force with a daytime attack by the US Air Force. More than 1,200 bombers dropped 3,900 tons of explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. Many of these bombs contained white phosphorus, an element that burns at extreme temperatures and is practically impossible to extinguish. The result was a firestorm that reached temperatures above 1,500 degrees Celsius, evaporating entire bodies and consuming oxygen from underground air raid shelters. The flames fed on wind created by the combustion itself, sucking people from streets and windows toward the heart of hell. The fire was so intense that asphalt streets melted like rivers of black lava. In the shelters, entire families died asphyxiated when oxygen was consumed by flames roaring above their heads. Estimates of the number of victims have varied dramatically over the decades. Some initial sources spoke of up to 135,000 deaths, although recent research estimates between 25,000 and 40,000 civilian deaths, mostly women, children, and elderly, along with thousands of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. Was there military justification for this attack? Dresden had some optical, machinery, and military component factories, but was not a crucial war production center. According to British documents declassified decades later, the main intention was to break German civilian morale and paralyze logistics in support of the Soviet advance. However, many of the bombs fell on the historic center and densely populated residential areas. The railway station, declared military objective, was barely damaged. Winston Churchill, in a subsequent internal memorandum he never sent, expressed his doubts. The destruction of Dresden raises serious reflection on Allied conduct. Was it really necessary? 2 years earlier, in July 1943, Hamburg had been the scene of the first deliberate firestorm experiment in history. Operation Gomorrah introduced a coordinated pattern of explosive bombs followed by incendiaries to maximize devastation. For 8 consecutive days, more than 2,300 aircraft launched 9,000 tons of bombs on the port city. On the night of July 27th, Hamburg became an urban furnace. Fire consumed more than 20 square kilometers. Asphalt melted into burning rivers. People suffocated in basements where oxygen disappeared, consumed by flames. More than 42,000 civilians died and 37,000 were wounded. Almost 1 million inhabitants were displaced. Allied intelligence reports documented total psychological destruction with records of collective terror, citizen paralysis, and irreversible moral collapse among the surviving population. From a military standpoint, Hamburg had greater strategic importance than Dresden. It was a crucial naval center and a key industrial city for the German war effort. But the violence of the attack exceeded any precedent and established the model for subsequent bombings specifically designed to create mass terror. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, the American bomber Enola Gay dropped over Hiroshima the first atomic bomb in history. Little Boy, with its uranium-235 core, released energy equivalent to 16,000 tons of TNT in a fraction of a second. The nuclear explosion not only generated devastating heat and pressure, it created a completely new type of destruction in human experience. Within a 2-kilometer radius of the epicenter, most people simply disappeared, instantly vaporized. Their shadows were imprinted on stone walls like grotesque photographs of their last moments of life. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. The temperature at the epicenter exceeded 1 million degrees Celsius, igniting the air itself and creating a fireball more than 250 meters in diameter. The shockwave demolished buildings within a radius of kilometers, while initial radiation condemned to slow death thousands who had survived the initial explosion. Approximately 30 minutes later, a previously unknown phenomenon began. A black rain loaded with radioactive particles that contaminated extensive areas outside the direct destruction zone. This rain carried invisible death to communities that had been far from the epicenter, extending lethal effects far beyond the immediate physical impact. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, with a plutonium core, destroyed Nagasaki. The explosion was more powerful than Hiroshima's, equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT, but the mountainous topography of the city limited destruction. Even so, between 35,000 and 40,000 people died instantly. Survivor accounts describe horrors that defy understanding. People with skin hanging in strips like burned paper, children without faces walking like sleepwalkers, hospitals crowded with victims whose wounds did not bleed, but who died days later from mysterious causes that would only later be identified as radiation poisoning. The atomic bombs, according to the American High Command, had a clear objective: to force Japan to surrender without the need for a land invasion that would have cost millions of lives. Files from Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, indicate that cities were selected for being intact targets, ideal for observing the complete effects of the weapon. By the end of 1945, the bombs had killed a total of 246,000 people in both cities, but death continued for decades. Cancers, leukemias, cataracts, and genetic malformations affected survivors and their descendants. Radiation had introduced a completely new element into war, the capacity to kill not only in the present but also in the future. The ethical debate over these bombings has continued for decades without definitive resolution. Defenders argue that atomic attacks avoided an invasion of Japan that would have cost millions of lives on both sides. American military estimates calculated between 500,000 and 1 million Allied casualties and several million Japanese in case of a land invasion. Critics maintain that Japan was already seeking surrender terms before the atomic bombings, and that the bombs were used more as a demonstration of power before the Soviet Union than as military necessity against Japan. They point out that the bombed cities had little direct military value, and that the proportion between civilian and military casualties was overwhelmingly unequal. Howard Zinn and other historians have characterized both Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki as scientific experiments rather than military necessities. In contrast, defenders like Paul Fussell, a war veteran, argued that without atomic bombs, he himself would have died in the invasion of Japan, along with hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. Declassified documents reveal the doubts that existed even among Allied leaders. Churchill ordered minimizing propaganda about Dresden after the bombing. Some Manhattan Project scientists, including Leo Szilard and James Frank, had recommended a demonstration of the atomic bomb in an unpopulated area before using it against cities. Mass bombings on civilians during World War II represent the historical moment when humanity crossed a fundamental technological and ethical threshold. For the first time, destructive power exceeded the capacity of any traditional army, and the war objective shifted from the enemy soldier toward the civilian population as a whole. The central question remains without definitive answer. Were these bombings necessary evils that shortened the war and saved lives? Or did they constitute the greatest crimes ever committed in the name of military victory? The answer may be found not in retrospective justifications, but in the preserved memory of victims, in photographs of charred bodies, and in the eternal silence of cities that were erased from the map in a matter of minutes. These bombings established precedents that forever transformed the nature of modern warfare. They demonstrated that technology had granted humanity the power to destroy not only enemy armies, but entire civilizations. The legacy of Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki does not reside in the justifications that have been offered for these acts, but in the permanent warning they represent about the limits that humanity must impose on itself, even in the most desperate moments of conflict.